The afternoon was clear. A woman in the Oklahoma Panhandle hung her wash on the line, squinting at a warm April sky. Then she turned north, and she stopped, because the horizon was gone. In its place stood a wall of black, 1,000 feet tall, rolling toward her faster than a car could drive. She had less than a minute. She grabbed her children, ran for the house, and slammed the door. And then the day went out like a lamp. Not dim, not gray, black. A darkness so total she could not see her own hand pressed against her face. This was April 14th, 1935. They would call it Black Sunday. But to understand how a wall of dirt 1,000 feet high could swallow an entire region, you have to go back, because what hit the plains that day was not a freak of nature. It was not an act of God, though many who lived through it were certain it was. It was a bill coming due, a disaster that human hands had spent 15 years plowing, quietly and proudly, straight into the ground. The story everyone tells is that a drought came and the land simply dried up and blew away. That is only half true, and the missing half is everything. The drought was real, but the drought was never the disaster. The disaster was what the land had already become in the years before the drought ever arrived. The plains had been quietly stripped of the one thing that had always held them together. For thousands of years, the southern Great Plains were an ocean of grass, buffalo grass, blue grama, deep-rooted native prairie that had weathered droughts for millennia. And the real secret of that grass was hidden underground, where no one could see it. The roots ran 5-6 feet deep, weaving the loose soil into a single living mat that even the fiercest prairie wind could not tear loose. That grass was the plains' armor. It held the moisture in the soil. It anchored the dirt against the wind. In a dry year, the grass on top would brown and wither and wait, but the roots below never let go. And when the rain finally returned, the whole land came back to life. It had done this for 10,000 years. It was built from the ground up to survive drought. And then people arrived with what looked like a much better idea. When the First World War broke out, Europe's farms burned, and its young men marched off to die, and its fields lay empty. The world went hungry, and the price of wheat exploded. Suddenly, the dry, cheap grassland of the plains was worth a fortune, if only you could get it planted. And a new machine had just arrived to make that possible: the tractor. The tractor did in a day what a horse team took a week to do. Farmers called it the Great Plow-Up. They tore into the prairie with a kind of hunger, ripping out the ancient sod and planting wheat wherever it would go. Between the war and the early 30s, they plowed under more than 100 million acres of native grass. For a while, it worked beautifully. The rains were generous all through the 20s. The wheat came up thick and gold from horizon to horizon, and the southern plains became the breadbasket of the entire world. People got rich almost overnight. They called it the next Garden of Eden. And in all that giddy prosperity, almost nobody stopped to ask the one question that mattered. What would hold that loosened, exposed dirt down if the rain ever stopped coming? Then the wheat market crashed along with the rest of the economy in 1929. Prices fell so low, so fast, that farmers could not even afford the fuel to harvest what they had grown. So they simply walked away. Millions of acres of plowed, bare, broken ground were abandoned, left naked and loose to the open sky. And then, in 1931, as if on cue, the rain stopped. The drought that came was severe, but the plains had survived worse before and always come back. What they had never once faced was a drought with no grass left to hold them. The native armor was gone, torn out, and thrown away. In its place lay millions of acres of fine, dry, pulverized topsoil, sitting loose on the open earth, exposed to the sky, waiting. All it needed now was wind. And on the high plains, wind is the one thing that never runs out. It came sweeping down off the Rockies, as it always had, but now it found the loose dirt lying open and unguarded, and it lifted it, first in thin ribbons snaking across the fields, then in rolling clouds, then in something the region had never seen in all its history, something so large and dark and alive that the people who watched it come ran clean out of words. They called them black blizzards, not storms of snow, but storms of earth. Towering walls of dust that rose thousands of feet into the sky and rolled across the flat land like something out of an ancient prophecy. They came in colors depending on which state's soil they carried, brown and rust red and coal black, and one by one they turned the afternoon sun into a dull copper coin before blotting it out of the sky entirely. The dust got into everything. It sifted through the cracks around windows that families had sealed with wet rags, tape, and flour paste. It settled in drifts against the walls, buried fence posts to the top, swallowed whole tractors, and coated the breakfast table again minutes after it was wiped clean. People ate with grit, crunching between their teeth, and woke with the outline of their own bodies printed in dust on the sheets. There was no keeping it out. The storms grew worse with each passing year. In May of 1934, a single blizzard of dirt rose 2 miles into the air and marched east across the entire width of the country. It dropped grit on the desks of Chicago and dimmed the streetlights there at noon. It sifted down over the U.S. Capitol in Washington and dusted the shoulders of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, more than 1,000 miles from where it began. It kept going. 12 million tons of plains dirt fell on Chicago alone. The cloud rolled out over the Atlantic, and 300 miles off the coast, sailors on the decks of ships watched a fine brown powder settle on their hands. It was Oklahoma. It was Kansas. It was the topsoil of the American heartland, drifting out to sea. In Washington, a Senate committee happened to be debating a soil conservation bill the very week that Eastern Storm rolled in. As the senators argued over whether the crisis 2,000 miles away was even real, the sky over the Capitol slowly went brown, and the dust of the ruined plains came sifting down onto the windowsills of the room. It made the argument for them more eloquently than any witness could. But even that was not the worst. The worst was still coming. April 14th, 1935, began as one of the clearest, calmest days anyone could remember. Families went to church. Children played outside in the sun. And in the far north, a cold front collided with the loose, dry earth and gathered it up into a single, monstrous wall of black moving south at 60 miles an hour. People saw it coming and could not comprehend what they were looking at. Birds flew ahead of it in a screaming panic. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a matter of minutes as the wall of black bore down on them, and then it hit. The world went black. Not dark, black. People in their own kitchens could not find the walls. Drivers on the road climbed out and lost their cars 3 feet away. Some were sure the world was ending, that this was the wrath in the Bible finally come. For hours, there was no light at all, only the roar of dirt scouring the walls of the house. When it finally passed, the estimates were almost impossible to believe. Black Sunday alone had torn an estimated 300 million tons of topsoil off the plains and thrown it into the sky in a single afternoon. Enough dirt to bury a city. The best of the land, the part that grew food, simply flew away. The very next day, an Associated Press reporter named Robert Geiger sat down to write about the region and its ruined earth, and he reached for a phrase that could hold the size of it. He called it the Dust Bowl. The name stuck to the map and then to history, and it never let go. But behind that tidy name were farms and animals and people who could not run from the air. They had no choice but to breathe. The cattle died first. Caught out in the open with nowhere to hide, they breathed the storms until the dust packed their lungs and coated their throats shut. Farmers who cut open the dead animals to understand it found their stomachs full of dirt, pounds of grit, swallowed a mouthful at a time with every desperate breath. And the herds the dust did not kill outright simply starved, because in that poisoned ground, nothing green would grow. And then the same thing that killed the cattle began to kill the people, not by burying them, by filling them. The finest particles of dust, far smaller than a grain of sand, rode the air deep into human lungs and lodged there. Doctors gave the new sickness a name that told you exactly what it did. They called it dust pneumonia. The lungs filled with dirt and inflamed until they could no longer pull in air. It struck the old and the weak, but above all, it struck children, whose small lungs had no defense. In Kansas, in 1935 alone, dozens died. Across the plains, the true number was far higher. Parents did everything. They hung wet sheets over the cribs. They pressed damp cloths to their children's faces and prayed the next storm would pass. But you cannot seal a house against dust this fine, and you cannot stop a child from breathing. Families buried sons and daughters who had simply inhaled the ground their fathers had plowed. For hundreds of thousands of families, there was finally nothing left to do but leave. Their crops were gone. Their land was quite literally blowing away over the horizon. Their children were coughing and sick, and the banks were foreclosing on whatever ruins remained. So they piled everything they still owned onto broken-down trucks and pointed them west, toward California, toward any place at all where the sky still knew how to hold rain. It became one of the largest migrations in American history, compressed into a few short years. Roughly 2.5 million people abandoned the plains. Whole counties emptied. The refugees were branded Okies, whether or not they came from Oklahoma. And California met them not with open arms, but with roadblocks, contempt, and starvation wages in the fields. Back on the plains, the ones who stayed and refused to go watched their entire world keep disappearing into the sky. And slowly, painfully, at a terrible cost, the country finally began to understand what the dust had been trying to tell it all along. This was not weather. This was not a curse. This was a wound. And a wound made by human hands might, just possibly, be healed by human hands as well. The federal government finally moved in. President Roosevelt created the Soil Conservation Service, and for the first time in the country's history, the nation treated plain dirt as something precious and worth saving. Government experts fanned out across the plains and taught farmers to plow along the natural curves of the land instead of in straight lines, so the furrows would catch and hold the rain instead of funneling it uselessly away. And they planted trees, more than 200 million of them, set in long rows called shelter belts that stretched from Texas all the way to the Dakotas. Walls of living wood grown for the single purpose of breaking the wind before it could reach down and lift the soil. They paid farmers to rest their exhausted land, to let the native grass creep back in, to slowly undo acre by painful acre, the great plow-up that had started all of it. And then, at last, in 1939, the rains returned. The grass began to green. The storms grew fewer and weaker, and the black blizzards faded from the skies of the plains. The Dust Bowl was over. But it did not end, because nature relented. It ended because people finally stopped fighting the land and started working with it. That is the part we forget. We remember the Dust Bowl as a natural catastrophe, a drought, a punishment sent down from an angry sky. It was not. The drought was only the trigger. The gun had been loaded 15 years earlier, one furrow at a time, by people who tore up the grass that had protected them and never imagined the ground could turn against them. The deadliest dust storms in the history of the world did not come from nature. They came from us, from good intentions and a wheat boom and a machine that could plow faster than anyone could think. The plains did not attack their people. Their people had, without ever meaning to, plowed the disaster into the ground themselves. And then one clear Sunday, the ground gave it back.